into positions of hopelessness and helplessness. The government gives them the drugs, builds bigger prisons, passes a 3-strike law, and then wants us to sing God Bless America. No, no, no. Not God Bless America. God damn America. That's in the Bible for killing innocent people. God damn America for treating us citizens as less than human. God damn America as long as she tries to act like she is God and she is supreme.
Hello.
Hello. What's up, everyone? I'm Jake fucking Flores. That's Anders J. Lee.
Here.
Present. And this is Pod Damn America, our stupid goth socialist podcast for the dumb children or whatever. Hello. Welcome to the show. I am very excited to talk about this book today. I've always wanted to do an episode about it. It's called Manufacturing Consent, and it is not a pickup artist manual, unfortunately. It's a very misleading title.
Yeah. Come to that. They probably would have a different title today.
What if it was a super woke Zoomer version of it? It was called Manufacturing Enthusiastic Consent. Are you in a headspace where you would like to hear about the Vietnam War? It's okay if you're not.
Yeah, you have to get consent from the reader before they plunge in. Just an introductory chapter with all the trigger warnings, genocide, etc.
Consent's a weird word because they literally took it from like a 1922 thing written by this guy Walter Lippmann, which is like early 20th century, like Edward Bernays era crazy, conceptions of mass manipulation and stuff. But then that word just comes up a lot now in a different light, so it's a little strange. But anyways, yeah. So
by that term, you mean consent or manufacturing consent?
Consent. The full term manufacturing. Well, I don't know. It's just like I don't know. It's like 90% of the time you're talking about sex nowadays when you talk about consent, and 10% of the time you're talking about Noam Chomsky, in my opinion. You know what? And that's just me. I don't know. I try to mind these things, both of them. They're very important.
Yes, indeed. You don't want to manufacture consent. I think there's the term enthusiastic consent is kind of cringe, but I do think there's something behind it as a philosophy or a sort of a something you should try to obtain. When you say it like enthusiastic, it's like, okay, what's going on here? But if you're hooking up with somebody and they're like, and you're like, do you want to have intercourse? And they're like, yeah, then that's kind of what it's about, right? If somebody's like acting that way.
Yeah, no, I mean, the truth is often cringe,
Yes.
That's it doesn't make it not right. It's just like, yeah, this does sound like I am being taught how to be a college student on my first day, where they're trying to keep all this shit from happening. Anyways, we're diverting wildly from Chomsky. Let's fucking talk about it. So I want to talk about this book, and it's an interesting one for me because one of the sort of central like contradictions or paradoxes or whatever of like doing a show like this for me is I always go in circles about this. I'm always like, where do we start when we talk? And part of me thinks, you know what? Everyone who's listening to this has probably already read Manufacturing Consent, right? It's like kind of one of the base tomes of left shit. And so maybe you should just go from there, because you can, if you have a bunch of people that have already like read all this stuff and have like a base education, then you can kind of do more advanced discussions and stuff. On the other hand, I often think we shoot ourselves in the foot with stuff like that, because then we're like, why do only like, a few thousand people listen to this show right now or whatever? And it's like, well, because you kind of like made it into an ivory tower. And I'm a populist. I'm a college dropout. That is the opposite of what I want to do. I think as someone who managed to somehow educate themselves into this shit kind of just by myself in a lot of ways after dropping out of college. I often find it very like condescending when someone's like, "Oh, we've all read Chomsky, right?" And I'm like, "What if you haven't?" Like that's very alienating, right? So I do a lot of primers and stuff. I'm going to continue backing up forever and doing like shit like this, because that's also like how it's an inherent contradiction in like the history of communism is having like this intelligentsia thing, and then there's question of like how do I get all these dumb poor people to understand what I learned in college, and like I think it's something you should be correcting for all the time or whatever. So not to even now I sound condescending. Maybe you fucking have read Manufacturing Consent. You should listen to me talk about it anyway, because to be entirely honest with you, I read it recently because I never finished it when I did read it before, and I've taken a couple stabs at it and not finished it, and I think that a lot of people also have never finished it. I think that's like it's one of those things that when you're like have you ever heard the band The Brick Walls?
Mm-mm.
No, but like
I know
like,
Pink Floyd.
but you fucked up the bit. So like that's not a real band. But sometimes you say that to somebody, they'll go like, "Oh yeah, totally," right? I know
Okay.
them, right? So I feel like some people are just lying, and I say that because I've talked to people about this, but then I've been like, "But you are not demonstrating that you understand like a proper critique of
Right.
media." A lot of liberals will tell you like, "Oh yeah, I read Chomsky in college."
This is like
Well,
when someone asked me in the early 2000s, like, "Oh, you're a fan of Nirvana? You got any of their concerts lately?"
yeah, and you lie. You're like,
I passed that test just because I have a fear of lying, but I'm sure I've definitely done. Oh, sounds familiar.
yeah, totally. It's like a weird impulse you have to, I don't know, it's an ego thing. But then also there's like, so maybe you didn't finish it like me. Maybe you did read it, but you didn't understand it. That's also very possible. It happens with shit all the time. Maybe, and this is what I really think happens a lot. This is also why I'm just like, let's talk about it right now. Is maybe you fucking read this book years ago and did understand it, and even after understanding what they're saying in this interesting fucking deconstruction of corporate media, years later, you're falling for this shit all over again because the media, the establishment corporate media stream thing they're describing here is constantly reinforcing itself. So maybe you need to read this shit once a year or something. I don't know. But you need to constantly be in critique, and you can lapse, you can just forget because it's such a powerful force. It's such a powerful like it's just literally establishing the bounds of reality at all times. This thing that's just coming out of out of rich people's pockets and through the corporate media and into our ears, and just just a steady drip. So that's my mission statement here. We all need to talk about this right now. I don't care who you are. I'm Larry the Cable Guy right now. I don't care who you are.
I have not finished Manufacturing Consent. I started reading it when I was 19, and it is a case of didn't finish the book, but did see the movie.
Fair enough. There's a movie. Yeah.
Yeah. That it's on YouTube if people want to check it out. It's a little bit, some might say, didactic. Like he'll be talking about something, and then there's just like an exact like representation of whatever the metaphor he's using like on screen. But it's worth watching. I definitely I part of the reason I'm here doing this podcast is because I worked at a video store in high school, and they had Noam Chomsky on VHS, and that was like I was into like Nader and Kucinich and stuff, but that was like one of the first people who I ever heard who was just like questioning the idea of capitalism itself and the state itself, which he doesn't necessarily get that much into in Manufacturing Consent. He and Ed Herman, but a very formative thinker for me and probably many of our listeners.
You know who else was a formative thinker in that exact same way? Check this out.
For us. Smug, greedy, well-fed white people have invented a language to conceal their sins. It's as simple as that. The CIA doesn't kill anybody anymore. They neutralize people. Or they depopulate the area. The government doesn't lie. It engages in disinformation. The Pentagon actually measures nuclear radiation in something they call sunshine units. Israeli murderers are called commandos. Arab commandos are called terrorists. Contra killers are called freedom fighters. Well, if crime fighters fight crime and firefighters fight fire, what do freedom fighters fight?
You ever think about it that way? He's so funny, but like he's comedy Chomsky. Oh,
yeah, for his time. I mean, I may have made this point before, but like for his time, him and like Bill Hicks, that was kind of like one of the only places you could get that sort of point of view, especially if you're not tuned into like academia or the like alternative media Chomsky world at that time. Like you couldn't really hear anybody saying anything like that anywhere else.
I think Bill Hicks, his bio, what you have to have a bio as a comedian that you just like put on your shit or whatever. Mm-hmm. One of his was I'm like Chomsky with dick jokes. And so he directly, like, I read books about him and shit. He read Chomsky, he talked about it and stuff. He was directly trying to relate this perspective through stand-up comedy or whatever. Also, I'm sorry I keep downplaying Ed Herman. It's for whatever reason, like I feel like Chomsky is like the Andre 3000 of this situation or something, where it's I don't know. I
mean, I didn't brush up on this, but there are some. He did have some issues with, specifically Herman had some issues with accuracy. I don't know if it was for this book, but for other subsequent books. So that's probably part of the reason we don't think of Ed.
Interesting. So his career didn't take off in the same way, or but then it's like, I mean, they did something super subversive here. So was he hyper like scrutinized? There's probably a lot of, I mean, there's a lot in this book. They describe a lot of inaccuracies that aren't really scrutinized.
Yeah.
But anyways, so let's talk about this a little bit up top before I get into it, because the thing is like, okay, so I'm a I didn't finish it person, right? And I just finished it this time. And part of the reason is it's a fucking slog. And the reason I think it's a slog is because they're making a really simple point in the book, actually. It's kind of just like really like one simple but elegant observation about media. But because it's a point that is going against this powerful postmodern force that is constantly reasserting itself and reshaping itself, it's one of those things where, like, if you're going against the status quo, you have to back up everything you're saying. If you are the status quo, you don't, which is kind of what the book is about, right?
Yeah.
But so to me, it reads like a court case where, like, there's just a fucking mountain of evidence that they pick through. And it's like, you kind of don't need to go through all of it with them, but it's there in case anyone tries to refute what they're saying. They need to, like, bring a mountain of just like finely tooth combed whatever the fuck the term is, details and just minutia and stuff to really explain how their model that they make in this book applies in these cases or whatever. I started reading this recently for no reason, just because I'm working through a pile of books that I never finished and stuff like that. And in the middle of doing that, a war with Iran broke out that very well may start World War III. So suddenly the book became really relevant, right? And
yes.
That's another reason you should read this book, because it's so long and war is so common that eventually a war will start while you're reading the book. And then you'll understand what the news is saying, right?
Yeah. Yeah, very sort of Orwellian, I guess. Not that George Orwell was responsible for the sort of terms of art that his characters used, but there's a quote, and I think this is a paraphrase from Vance, that today he's saying, it depends what war means as to whether or not we're war with Iran. He's saying that we're at war not with the country, but with the nuclear program. which I don't know if there's a way they can put that on an island somewhere and isolate it from all the people who live in Iran. But it appears, as of the time that we're recording, that Trump is calling this a one-off and saying that he's doing the taco thing.
He's
Uh,
like, hey, this was a lot of fun, but I got married,
Right.
It's a tryst. What happens in Iran stays in Iran,
Yeah.
One-off is hilarious. Yeah, so like Iran is a really great reason to be talking about this because to some extent, like the model that they describe in the book is applicable, and to some extent it's not. And that's really kind of why I want to talk about this right now, because I, I argue on the internet a lot. I don't know, I'm on Twitter all the time talking to people, kind of like to consume the takes there and see what's going on in that specific subculture. And I feel like I believe this book is relevant. A lot of people don't. And the reason for that is that it was published in 1988 and it's had a couple of like revisions and stuff like that. But it is about a pre-internet world and it's about media. So there's definitely an argument to be made that like something definitely changed when the internet came about. And in a lot of ways, the internet democratized media. And there are these really observable, upsides to this. Like something I always talk about is like, Gaza, like it's different this time because there's just so much like cell phone camera footage and stuff like that. There's no way for them to control and keep a cover on it. So that has this effect, right? And that's a good thing about media. And it's like why I make a show like this and why I think this is like a worthwhile project is because the democratization of media created like it kept them from being able to like silo everything, and it created room for dissent, right? But it's a little more complicated than that. Like I was thinking about like hypernormalization, the Adam Curtis documentary where he's talking about like the early internet, people had these utopian ideas about it. And then, like this weird postmodern thing happens where it becomes, instead of the thing that freed us, it becomes the biggest prison of all time. It folds back on itself. And I think that, but that's like where the battle lines lay right now for like trying to spread consciousness and effectively get enough people on the side to like, I don't know if it's even possible, stop, the government from bombing another country or whatever. There's an argument to be made that the internet is a tool for that. But I think a lot of people like think that that the forces of consent manufacture haven't effectively captured the internet and they're not present. And there is like this idea because, people are like allowed to be a little bit more dissenting now that before when you had a war rollout and you had like nothing but like TV and radio manufacturing the consent for it, they effectively brainwashed people into supporting all these U.S. interventions in other places, right? And now, I think a lot of people are telling us that what's different about now is that actually no one wants to go to war with Iran, and yet they're doing it anyways.
Yeah.
And so we're in this situation where we're like aware that we're like held prisoner, right? And we're like literally like no one wants to, like Trump's base, like a lot of them are like, what the fuck is happening? Like, why we thought he was the no war president or whatever. And there's all these great examples of that online of people having meltdowns and go, he's not who I thought I was or whatever, right? And with like the Democratic Party, it's like, hey, fuck you, like nobody supports Israel, like we all hate you, and you're supporting Israel, right? It's an unpopular thing, is like a thing that gets brought up often, and that's true. However, let me go on a journey with you here, right? So like, how do I explain this? Okay. Daniel Bessner, friend of the show, he wrote a piece a few years ago that I found really interesting. I was using like Jacobin or something like that. Is about video games. It's about first-person shooters like Call of Duty and stuff like that,
Mhm.
and how they've existed for a long time. And their military propaganda. They literally table at high schools and go, "Hey, do you like Call of Duty? Do you want to go do it in real life?" Always talk
Yeah.
about this. But like they've existed for so long, they've existed through the arc that I'm describing of the era of this book versus now. And in the beginning of these video games being a thing, they were like, it's World War II. You're the Allies. You're going to fight some Nazis, right? You had a story. You had a fucking role. It was, heroes and villains and stuff like that. And now they've kept making these things. They sometimes, I don't know, they veer out of like reality. They go into hypothetical fake wars and stuff like that. But the vibe of them isn't you are the good guy, there's a bad guy. It's really much like it's kind of like like that fucking Civil War movie or something like that, where everything is non-specific. There are these ideas floating around. There's states, there's communism, there's capitalism, but it's all presented like you're in a you have a gun. You're part of some faction. Go do a thing. War is just a fact of reality. It's just kind of a vague cynicism about it, and that's the only way, because it's like the only way you can make a game anymore in a world where now everyone understands like, oh, we're kind of the bad guy and stuff like that. It's all very like David Simon to me, honestly. There's this cynicism to it that is presented as like wisdom, right? And I would argue consent manufacture still exists. It doesn't exist in the form of people being manipulated into supporting a war. It exists in the form of people being convinced that the correct point of view is to say, war is a fact of reality. I don't like it either, but we have to vote for this person because otherwise it's the other person and they're going to do it worse. And like you heard a lot of this like during Obama, right? Because Obama, like a lot of people's point of view changed during Obama from like, oh, he's going to stop all the wars to, wait, he's not doing it. And then going like a lot of liberals would say like, I mean, it's hard for him, right? Because the president has to do this. Like the president's job is to be a war criminal, is things that people have said to me before. And, it's just like about doing it well, and doing it as like efficiently as possible and stuff. And like it's an ugly fact of reality. But there's this point of view that like that's wisdom, that giving that up is actually like you're mature and learned. And other people that like protest the war and criticize people like Barack Obama are naive and they're these dumb college students and they have blue hair and shit. They don't understand.
Yeah.
That's something that makes that person feel correct and feel good. And that's always what's for sale. That's what sells like hotcakes. It's the thing where it's about the self and your like validation and stuff like that. So
Right.
I would say this stuff remanifests itself with new technology. That's what I'm getting at. Like,
Yeah.
you are not immune to propaganda, the Garfield meme, right?
Right. But I would also say though that, because this is an argument hurled at Chomsky a lot is people will say like, oh, well, aren't these things like the Iraq war, isn't that unpopular? Isn't U.S. foreign policy unpopular? And the propaganda is not working very well, huh? And his point is often to highlight the unpopularity of these sort of machinations, because his focus is really on the quote unquote power elite, as he describes them, who he says are way more indoctrinated than the average person, the average American, and what the agenda setting media, such as the New York Times, they rationalize things like American imperialism. And that's what he analyzes, is how the elites justify this to themselves, essentially. And it often does trickle down in different ways. But by and large, he's kind of pointing to a separation between popular opinion and elite opinion.
That's fair, and I think I agree with him that I like a lot of people think like, they're laughing at us. They're getting away with everything, and they're fucking having a party at our expense up there. I don't believe that. I think that the fucking ruling class believe their own bullshit.
Yes.
And it's because they're they live lives that are completely weird and disconnected from reality. So you're able to just fucking rewrite reality and be like, it's justifiable that I have all this shit, right? The capacity for that is massive. Everyone, does it to some extent, and the more power you have, the more you do it, right? So like something that had me thinking about a lot of this stuff recently is I was watching Mad Men, and in the first season, there's this character arc, right? Peggy Olson, the secretary, she
Irish
is
Norwegian woman, or Norwegian Catholic, which makes no sense, but I think they explain that at some point. But regardless,
the character or the actress?
the character, yeah, she's from the Norwegian section of Brooklyn, which existed back in the day, but also goes to a Catholic church.
Little Swedish fish town. She
Yes.
actress is a Scientologist, but that's near here nor there. So the character though, she's Don Draper's assistant. Don Draper is like this interesting fucking product of American capitalism. He, is an orphan who like learned to manipulate all this fucked up shit about American culture and society to become a master salesman from it, right? And she's like an assistant, so she's around him a lot, and just by kind of osmosis, she's in the background. She goes under everyone's radar because she's a woman and they're all misogynist. And then every once in a while, she pitches a copyright thing, and they're like, "Wow, she's like really good at this." And it's like, the idea is kind of like she's absorbed some stuff, she's been underestimated, and she really, really understands advertising, which is not an admirable thing really, but like it's is like when you watch, you're like, wow, she got a job. So anyways, she goes on a date in like the end of the first season with some guy, and he sucks. He's like annoying. He's like this annoying frat guy or whatever. He's telling her all about his job or whatever, and she's like not interested. And he's like, so what do you do for work? She tells him she's an advertiser, and he goes, advertising? I mean, come on, that shit doesn't work. Like, why would I buy something just because someone told me to buy it? And she says, when it doesn't work or when you think it doesn't work is when it works the best. And I would challenge every fucking person to think about that when you are certain that you are not being manipulated, or that other people aren't being manipulated, and that none of this still is relevant. Because my take on this book is that they really just hyper focused on a specific facet of what in Marxist terms is known as like the superstructure, like the idea that the material base of reality has outcomes in like this massive culture and set of ideological boundaries that we all live inside of, and it functions as a cycle to reproduce the material functions of reality of society, which are capitalists. So it's like it's not a conspiracy. No one's fucking the Wizard of Oz isn't fucking pulling a bunch of strings and going, oh, make them do this now, make them do this war. It's naturally occurring organic processes. And when you have a system like this where there's inequality and there's powerful people that have all the power, they are naturally going to be incentivized to protect their power, and the outcomes are shaping the culture and shaping the bounds of reality and creating this like postmodern capitalist realist sort of situation, the haze or whatever. And that's done. And they're hyper focused. Him and Herman here are hyper focused on how that really functions through media. And I think it's a pretty good thing to hyper focus on, because it's probably one of the most, maybe the most powerful facets or functions or mechanisms for capitalist superstructure to like reproduce itself. And that's why I think it's you can take what they're doing here and expand it, and it keeps its relevance still, because you might argue that parts of this went away, right? Parts of this are no longer relevant or need to be updated, but the idea that we live in a capitalist superstructure has not changed. It's just the shape of it that's changed, Also kind of thinking about like the new Jim Crow sort of ideas, like when a thing in its more overt form goes away, then we live in this place where we're like, oh, it's over. And it's like, no, it just remanifests itself, you know, if you don't like actually solve the problems that lead to it or whatever. So, yeah, so that's pretty much where I'm at. And like the internet, you know, plays into this in an interesting way. I'm not a doomer about it. I don't think he is either, or they are. I don't think they're saying like there's nothing you can do. I think you know, there's kind of a call to action in this book about what they're saying, which is independent media solves for this to some extent, but you have to understand why independent media gets marginalized for dissent in order to like effectively do that, you know, because you're not going to start a podcast that's going to become like CNN or something, you know, or especially if it, I mean, you will if you're not a dissenter, you know, like Joe Rogan and like these huge things that have become alt media spheres. The fact that they got that big should tell you that they are not actually dissenting, and you should be like really weary when people try to argue that they are, because that's not how it works, right? You're going to be pushed back against and marginalized, and you just have to maneuver, you know, in that way. You have to, with that in mind, in order to like fight the fight or whatever. So, book opens with an explanation of this thing they call the propaganda model, which is like this, it's like a model they use. They invoke it throughout the entire book and go, hey, does this lens apply to the Vietnam War or this thing that happened or this assassination or whatever? And they give all these examples of why they say it does. And something's interesting is that, like, so the book most after this chapter is just a series of case studies about media coverage of various international things that have happened in recent history when they wrote this book. And they say that they picked on purpose a bunch of cases that should break the propaganda model. Like if the propaganda model isn't true, then these things, talking about Cambodia or the fucking assassination of Archbishop Romero, you know, should be like the things that are hardest to apply for it to apply to. And then the results are, no, it hella applies or whatever. That's kind of the argument of the book.
Yeah.
So propaganda model, let's see. We understand authoritarian states to have biased media, right? So yeah, this is a good thing to talk about up top. Americans, you know, we think we're free, right? Because we are taught via, you know, Cold War indoctrination and stuff like that, that in Soviet Russia, fucking car drives you, you know. In Soviet Russia, there is this top-down authoritarian censorship. Or in China, right, there's this top-down, the government will literally stop you from saying a thing if it goes against the, you know, the agenda of the government. A lot of people would argue that's not true. I'm sure to some extent it's not. To some extent it is. I think the argument to be made here is not that it's not true. It's that we also have a powerful authoritarian form of censorship. What we don't understand is that it's like top down versus bottom up, kind of, but it effectively has the same outcomes, which is that we both live in superstructures, right? Superstructures reproduce the fucking base there. So in a communist state, the state is going to feel free to just go, look, we decided to think it's a good idea to try to fucking tell the story this way. Whereas in the United States, the dumbest thing that we have is this fucking myth that we have objective media, and that like the media is like, the one thing you hear people invoke all the time is it's the fourth estate, right? That it's actually like a democratic like check, you know, it's like a part of the what balances everything out or whatever. And like to some extent, I mean, it's like it could be, if not for what they immediately talk about the book here, right? We generally do not understand that press in a free market economy operates in the same way because it censors and shapes information. The way it censors and shapes information is much more insidious. The main selling point is the myth of objectivity, the argument that by the very nature of it not being officially censored by the government, it must be like truth, like objective truth or whatever. And that actually convinces people to believe shit, I think, way harder than if you read something and you're like, the government like fucking, tweaked this because they want me to say it. The fact that Americans think they're free, and they think when they watch Fox News and MSNBC and Rachel Maddow and whoever the fucking Bill Maher or whatever, like all these things they're like, oh, this is like, we're not being censored, so this obviously has no one pulling the strings behind it. But let's see, also the paper of record, right? New York Times like has that branding, the paper of record. There's like this legitimacy to it. It's sort of an elitism. Another thing in like right-wing shit, I learned this from reading Cliff Nesterov's book where he talks about like right-wing think tanks and stuff. So like when you see someone on TV, a lot of times it'll have, the little chyron below them that has like their title. So whenever you see people doing like really ultra right-wing shit, often it'll just say the name of a think tank, and it'll say like senior fellow. That's your title. And that's entirely made up. It's not a thing. It's just, if you donate money to a right-wing think tank that wants to do horrible shit, they give you the title senior fellow. It's like, it's not a job. Like, you don't do anything or whatever.
It's a donation tier.
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
It's a Patreon thing, a pay pig for fucking, Turning Point USA or whatever. I gave the highest amount. But like, why do they do that? Right? Because that, if you're not really thinking about it, that just does this subtle like legitimacy thing. You just go, okay, well, this person is clearly in a position of authority in some way, so great. And yeah, it's bullshit, So, now if you don't get this, you're being told a corporate agenda, a corporation's agenda, while believing that it's impossible for it to be an agenda, which is kind of even more insidious, right? So how do they get away with this, right? Something they talk about a lot, something that's invoked a lot, and it's something to keep in mind constantly, I think, is like framing, because there's kind of a you hear like, socially conscious hip hop and like comedians that are kind of like in the Bill Hicks vein and stuff say like the media lies, right? It's a very common thing. Oh, they lie, they spew out lies or whatever. And I think that's not all. I don't think that's all the way there. I think the more insidious thing that corporate media does in capitalism is what Emily Dickinson would refer to as tell the truth, but tell it slant, right? Like you lie by omission and things like that. So, one thing that you notice a lot if you follow people who critique stuff like the New York Times in terms of the genocide and all the fucking horrible propaganda that they push is active voice versus passive voice. Kind of what Carlin was talking about with like,
right.
It's an Israeli, it's a commando. If it's a fucking Arab, it's a terrorist or whatever.
Yeah.
But active voice and passive voice is like when a cop kills someone, it's like local resident was shot at by a bullet, right? Passive voice is when something happens to a thing. And then when a MS-13 gang member kills someone, it's MS-13 member murders someone in cold blood, right? That's active voice. Someone does a thing. It's just a grammar concept. And, it's subtle. You don't think about it. But that does things like it frames the story in a certain way where, in the passive voice, it's very apologetic to whoever did the killing. It happens all the time with like cops and stuff like that. And I don't know. So there's also just like how much space in media is allotted to a thing. Like if we lived in an authoritarian situation, like a more, state-run thing, then you would not, like, a story that the state didn't want you to know about, they just wouldn't print. But the thing is, if you did that here, people would kind of know, like, oh, wait, what the fuck? They're, like, censoring this thing. So what you see a lot of throughout this book is, like, examples of things where they're, like, they told the story, but they limited it to, like, 2 paragraphs on page 10 of the New York Times.
Mm-hmm.
And then the fact that gives them, like, this kind of interesting space of, like, plausible deniability and be like, well, we told the story, I guess it just wasn't that popular or whatever. And then the other thing that they want to push they print over and over and over and over and over and over and over. So that's not lying. That's not censorship. It's just fucking framing, right?
Right.
So, and another big one I think to keep in mind is like reducing the argument. So this is like a really fucking evil one. I think about it all the time. You know, here's an example, right? The conversations that are happening about ICE right now. It should be, if we actually had a press and a political system and everything that was supposedly this like free market of ideas, and there was, you know, everyone got their voice heard or whatever, and democracy functioned a way where the people's will was actually represented, we wouldn't have this situation where everyone's like, I don't want to go to war, right? And yet it's still happening. You also would probably have someone saying we shouldn't police the border, like at all.
Mm-hmm.
Or we shouldn't be fucking fascists about the border. And that you would have two sides, for and against, you know, borders, basically. But instead, what we have in the Democrats and Republicans is an argument between who's going to police the border more humanely, which is the Democrat argument, or more effectively, which is the Republican argument. And that's just a clever way to get outside of the argument of should we be doing this at all. Is, you know, Republicans and Democrats often just, you know, get told, okay, you're on this. You're both, we're arguing both to do it, but how to do it. And that creates all these implications. So you read the newspaper and then you go, well, I guess everyone wants to do this, right? And only a crazy person wouldn't want to. Oh, somebody said they don't want to in the street, but that's a naive fucking college blue-haired kid protester. The generally people like are for this. And it's fucking fake. It's an outcome of, you know, the agenda of people that want borders, which is people with all the fucking money and capital. Yeah. So another example is right now, like Trump with this fucking Iran shit, where he's gonna start World War III. You know, they fucking bombed Iran. I almost want to divert and get into this a little bit because I'm so fucking mad about it. I'm sure we'll cover it on the show a lot, but like, do not believe this fucking bullshit they tell you in the media about this. Iran does not have nuclear weapons. It doesn't want nuclear weapons. It's part of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. Iran or Israel is not part of the fucking thing where they inspect your nuclear program. Israel has nukes. It doesn't make any sense. Just do not let them fucking brainwash you about this. This is absurd that this is happening. And the fact that it is so fucking absurd and it's just flat out an attack that is unjustifiable, both the Israel preemptive attack, quote unquote, and what Trump just did, you know, those things there should be some fucking opposition to, right? And we have this Democratic Party that people believe is the opposition. So shouldn't the Democratic Party be like the person going, hey, you shouldn't be doing this? Well, no, because they reduce the argument again. So instead of there being a debate about whether we should be for or against starting a fucking world war, what the Democrats are saying right now is that he didn't get permission from Congress. That's the problem, right? Is that he didn't fucking go by the rules or whatever. This happened with the fucking ICE protests, where it's like, is anyone gonna be against this? No. The Democrats are like, yeah, why did he bring in the National Guard? It's like, don't bring anyone in. Don't bring the fucking cops in either, right? There should be someone against this, but it gets reduced. So something to look out for at all times, right? And then a final framing method I think is really interesting is allowing just a little bit of dissent, which I talked about already, and also talk about again when it comes to Vietnam in a minute. But like, you know, if the system, if the superstructure, right? I don't even want to do a lot of they stuff here because it's an organic process. If it doesn't allow anyone to disagree, then it's actually endangering itself, because that's going to cause people to go, oh, this is like a fucking totalitarian system, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if it allows for a little dissent, then it both like rids itself of that problem and also marginalizes any voice of dissent by making you look like, well, you're only a tiny amount of the population. Why else would you be on page 10 of the New York Times in one paragraph, right? Clearly, it just must be not many people that don't want to bomb Iran and that are against the genocide and stuff. Fringe issue, right? Oh, go back to your drum circle. So anyways, this is all sort of conceived of as they lay it out in the first chapter. These things called filters. There's 5 of them, and they say these filters are what, instead of it being a top-down thing where there's censorship, where the state intervenes, there's filters. It's bottom up. So it's everything is allowed to be published, but not everything makes it through these filters, and then you end up with the end result that's skewed.
Yeah. And you get the one-off, if you will, leftist who sometimes makes it on the news or into the New York Times or whatever, and then they can point to that and be like, see, we do talk to you guys, but they're never like legitimated in the same way, or they never got the same, like anything approximating an even amount of airtime.
Yeah, and they do stuff like, I mean, famous story about Janine Garofalo during the Iraq War is that she was like one of the only fucking famous people that was against it for, you know, at least for like the first phase or whatever. It's one of those things where like everyone will always be against this eventually or whatever. Nowadays, everyone says they're against it, but she was a lone dissenter because she's a fucking iconoclast. And so they would have her on like the news sometimes, but they would have her on alone. And they knew she's a fucking comedian and not an academic and not a pundit and stuff. So they'd purposely isolate someone and shoulder like a fucking comedian with the burden of having to explain all of this shit. And the fact that that's too much of a challenge, and then she'd flub a little bit, not by any fucking, you know, anything, any fault of her own, just because that's an impossible thing to have to like back up everything. That gets then used to be like, look, this argument is like dumb and bad. And like, if this person couldn't explain all of material history and capitalism and reality and why this war started, then like, you know, it's one of those things where the status quo doesn't have to justify itself every time, but dissent always does. And it's clever framing, you know? They do that all the time. I mean, like fucking right-wing podcasts do that all the time. I used to listen to fucking Race Wars, Kurt Metzger's podcast when I was an idiot. And like one of the things I figured out after the fact is that he was a fucking really right-wing guy. I didn't really understand it. He hated cringe, you know, leftist, liberal, whatever. So he would find the most egregious examples of a crazy fucking Portlandy, ridiculous, you know, like leftist person, and bring them on alone and surround them with a bunch of his like tough crowd, angry comic guys. And, you know, it would be impossible for that person to fucking win any argument. And then they were the entire representation for the left in general. And so the end product is you get a message of like, see, like they're idiots, right? The whole thing, the left is wrong because this person couldn't fucking defend it or whatever, because we found the weirdest person or whatever. And like, I don't know, the filter concept here, like the bottom up kind of versus top down thing, I think is also like, it's a thing that I think, if the fact that people don't understand it is why you have like this hysteria around like cancel culture and stuff like that, because, you know, I don't know, because it's no one's stopping you except for filters that are just like things that keep you from making it all the way to a thing or whatever. Also, I mean, but it's a lot of times when people are complaining about that, it's not these filters because they're not dissenting in any way. They're just like not successful or whatever. But I mean, a lot of people get into conspiracy theory thinking about it, and they're like, well, it must be fucking, we have a secret deep whatever. I'll get into that later. But let's talk about the filters. Okay, so the filter number 1 is size, orientation, and profit motives of mass media. So in the early days of newspaper printing, there were actually some very popular working class newspapers that gave rise to like the Labour Party and stuff like that in England. I think it was called like the Herald or some shit over there. And they were actually very popular. Like they're very widely read. But like this is when newspaper, you know, mass production is like early, like it's a new thing. And they didn't die off because people didn't read them. Oddly enough, what happened is, or at least what the argument they make here in this book is, first thing that happened is that capitalists, like, you know, like fucking William Randolph Hearst kind of style, you know, what do you call them? Captain of industry. What the fuck is it? Robber baron type people or whatever that were like establishing early press. The first thing they did was they attempted to crush them with state intervention. The leftist newspapers, they lobbied for like taxes, to create a system where there's just like a restrictively high level of taxes you have to pay if you're a newspaper, just to filter out, anyone's ability to like start a small enough newspaper.
Oh.
And the thing is, it didn't work. It actually, like, for whatever reason, didn't kill off stuff like this. I think it's called the Herald, the one I'm talking about in England.
Is that why zines exist? Because they were like, oh, this isn't a newspaper. This is a different thing.
Yeah, no, it's technically you can't tax me as a newspaper. It's a zine. It's got a really good recipes for vegan donuts in the back. So that didn't work, right? But interestingly, the market eventually just does the job for them, which is what a lot of them believed would happen anyway. But the natural logic of the free market, it reinforced the fucking capitalists, right? Why wouldn't it? It does that with everything, right? They have all the money, so they have all the control. So that happened in part due to the next filter, which is advertising license to do business. So when the model of like how do you monetize media, how do you make a newspaper make money, that first started to like form, right? We still have it today. It's the advertising thing, right? Well, there are a lot of interesting things that come out of this model, right? One of them I didn't really have a conception of before I read this is that because readers of working class media aren't affluent, advertisers were not interested in putting ads in the working class newspapers. So I always kind of thought, because with us, for a lot of the time, we get approached by advertisers all the time. And I go, fuck you. I don't do that because then we're beholden to you. Like,
I don't know about all the time, but yeah, at least once. I mean, something I've noticed too is that a lot of ads now are for like luxury items, like watches and stuff. And I've thought before, like, why? This is such a small percentage of people who are gonna buy that, but the companies figure they're expensive enough to we actually make way more money by getting like this small scintilla of people to buy watches instead of getting like millions of people to buy a type of detergent.
Yeah, I mean, you sell one watch, and that's the same thing as selling,
Yeah.
like a million of something else, right?
Yeah.
I think that this is probably something. This probably isn't one-to-one. Like things are not entirely the same now, but that this is like a root of understanding what advertising is now. Because advertising products also get advertised to the proles because they want you to consume with the fucking meal tickets they pay us with or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a lot of order Grubhub or whatever, shit like that. But I think is a really interesting point, which is that part of how all this got shaped into where the establishment media had the hegemony is that advertisers there was no incentive for them to pay money to the working class dissenting media at all. And advertising in general skews toward the rich, right? Oh shit. I gotta pause real quick. There we go. Okay, so so I don't know, interesting point here. It's kind of made me think about how advertising is part of the superstructure, because you have these moments sometimes where you go, wait a minute, it really is kind of the they live world where you don't actually need to be buying stuff constantly, but the presence of this, the point of it is to make you feel that way and stuff. And of course, this stuff was aimed at the people with spending money back in the day. So now, I guess what I'm getting at is now when I see an ad, sometimes I'm like, oh wait, they think I have money and that I should go buy this thing, and it's making me think I should go buy it too. And you actually can just not. I don't know. You can fight this weird impulse as part of this. I don't know. That really won't really set me on a journey. Anyways, filter number 3: sourcing mass media news. this is like one that I cannot fucking stress enough. It fucking makes me so angry, which is that so like national news and stuff like that, I think there's this like fairy tale that people believe in, that it's just a bunch of hardworking journalists who are, just scouring our society and trying, coming up with these stories about what's important and what's going on, and that they have their own point of view, and wow, they're so smart. And the thing is, so he describes them as nodes. He says the White House, the Pentagon, and the State Department are central nodes for information and media. And I guess what the point of that is, what's important to understand here is that, like, so, the correct order of power, really, to understand is that it's like network. There's no governments. There's only these big multinational corporations, right? That's the real God. That's who really runs the world. Big capitalist, multinational, capitalist interests, right? Then they have the state, which they sort of like infest, and it's not a separate thing. It's how they like they channel and launder a lot of this power. And so the collaboration there between the state and big multinational corporate interests results in this shit where the State Department and the Pentagon, right, they do these things on behalf of capitalists, on behalf of the ruling class, start wars and stuff like that. And so in order to sell those interests through the media, someone's job at the fucking Pentagon or at the State Department, a lot of people's job is every morning when they have a new thing that happened, like they bombed Iran, is to come up with a way to package that story, pre-package it, and then go to where the news is made and go, hey, check this out. I did your fucking job for you. I already made the story. You can just read it. You don't have to ask questions about where some of these claims come from. They're just, trust me, they came from their official and stuff. They talk about this on like Citations Needed all the time, where there's just like this squishy language where it's just like, no one ever questions like, this fact just, it's verified by the State Department. Well, who said that? The State Department. Okay, well, you know what I mean? Like, that doesn't really make sense.
Yeah.
And like this also exists on a local level with propaganda. I read something interesting recently about propaganda and how like so much of like local news is stories about crime and stuff like that, and they're presented a certain way, to make cops seem like heroes and criminals seem like fucking villains, and them as the solution to all of society's problems. We just need to fucking fund more police and stuff like that. And this journalist who worked at a local police station or a local news network was saying, like, we kind of know it's propaganda. Like, we know that it's kind of wrong. But the thing is, if you are like an underfunded local news TV station, every day, you and your skeleton crew of journalists have to get up and make the fucking news. You can either sit down and do all the work yourself, or this fucking cop shows up with like a bunch of prepackaged stories, and they're like, we did the work for you. We fucking have all these stories. Just plug them into the thing. You're done with your job. And so it creates this division between the active work of trying to fucking like put yourself out there and tell stories like really, really, with against the status quo, or just on your own, or do work, versus the passive work of just being a fucking conduit for these prepackaged things. And you can either convince yourself that well, they're good guys, they're the cops, so I'm glad I can help them and whatever, or you can just do like what this guy's saying and be like, I know, but like, what the fuck else are you gonna do? And I think it's like that's a good micro example of what's happening in macro with the Pentagon and the State Department and all of our cable news and stuff. Same shit. Why would they want to work when some military officer shows up and goes like, we just read what we said, it's good and people will believe it. Filter number 4, flack and the enforcers. So this is like discipline of the media, by corporations and the state funneling money into think tanks and politicians, political campaigns, and stuff like that. This is a really kind of mind-bendy one for me. It's kind of a hall of mirrors, because with discourse in shit like comedy about like cancel culture and stuff like that, there's like a lot of like people that I think like want to use this model on themselves, and they're not justified in doing so. So flack is like, every once in a while on TV there would be a story, like a documentary about destruction of the environment by big like chemical companies or something like that, and literally those companies would pull advertising from ABC or whatever news network aired it and stuff like that. And that's like the material attack, the material discipline. But then they would also hire these like senior fellow people to appear on programs and attack that and whatever. And a big way of framing that attack is often that there's a liberal bias in the media. It's the thing you hear all the time. And that's like a really pervasive, wrong, and tricky idea that there's a liberal bias in the media. It's a way of creating this argument that like you hear all the time where it's like, well, because the media is so biased liberally, let's have this far right person on to balance things out, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is like the argument you hear a lot in comedy on podcasts where people have fucking JD Vance on their show and stuff like that, because that overlaps really well with the ideology of free speech and thinking like, well, we're just kind of having everyone on. But the central premise is wrong, which is that the media has a liberal bias. It does not, as discussed. It has the status quo bias, right? It's just State Department propaganda and stuff. So we're actually doing, go ahead.
Well, I mean, Chomsky himself says that it's like an establishment liberal bias. Like when the New York Times, there are most news publications and outlets, the majority of reporters are liberal, but what they put out is kind of an extension of like American imperial liberalism. It's not what we're putting out, right? I think seems to me like he's kind of drawing a distinction between what people mean by liberal bias and what that actually entails.
Yeah, I mean, this is like a kind of nomenclature-y kind of messy area, because when some people say liberal, they mean left, and when some people say liberal, they mean, I would argue that liberalism is part of the ultimately big picture right wing, and we live in a right wing country and stuff like that.
But you're saying that they, because they trip over themselves on like ABC or whatever to not appear liberal in any sense, that ultimately makes it conservative, the way they disseminate information or what they choose to disseminate.
Yeah, like I kind of want to talk about centrism a little bit in this, and that it like reshifts everything in a certain way. So if you start with the premise that there is when I say liberal bias, I think what they're trying to get across is that there's like a leftist thing. Like right wing people think that like the media is like radical communist leftists or whatever, and that argument creates this pretense for the second argument, which is that like, hey, so you should just let us balance it out a little bit. Just hear me out. Let me have this far right guy on to just balance out your far left agenda.
Yeah.
And because that's not actually a far left agenda, it's a status quo reproducing kind of centrist, squishy liberal thing. It casts the far right as fair. It casts the center as the left, and the left is not in the picture at all.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, it reminds me of PBS, which for a while had its logo was a face looking left, and then one Republican somewhere complained about it, so they changed it, and now it's the face is looking right.
Why is it just looking forward? Andrew Yang. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's insane. That's so stupid. Okay, so yeah, I don't know. This is a real thing, but I think it's interesting that like a lot of comedians, try to adopt this for their own story, and like over and over again you get these ideas like Dave Chappelle is, says something homophobic, and then there's a reaction to him on social media, and I think he tries to invoke like, I'm just like Lenny Bruce, I'm just like
Right.
when the establishment censors when it does flack. He's kind of invoking flack. The thing is, in that case, like, it gets confusing because it can feel like that if you're like a comedian, but like, thing is, if you're arguing a homophobic thing, you're the status quo. You're the flack. You are disciplining a dissenting thing in society, which is queer trans people. They're a tiny minority of people. Everyone fucking hates them, you can convince yourself otherwise if you believe that there's a liberal bias in the media and all this stuff. If you just let yourself get manipulated by having things represented disproportionately. But actually, Chappelle is the fucking flack, and queer people are still the dissent. And it's when gay people make fun of Dave Chappelle, that's actually a pretty admirable, like, populist fucking dissent, and it's only possible because of the internet. But his feelings get hurt, so he reframes it as, oh, no, I'm the dissent and they're the flack. And like, I don't know, I think these are good tools for kind of understanding this, because you can see it when you have the vocabulary of dissent and flack. Like, oh, is this person casting themselves as the wrong one? Because the right wing is constantly trying to invert this and cast themselves as the dissent, which is impossible. Conservatism can't be the new punk rock because it is the status quo. It's the thing that already rules everything or whatever. It'll never actually be true. Like, the police and the government and the church and everything ever is on your side. So, sorry, you're not the dissent, you're the flag. And then the final filter is anti-communism as a control mechanism. The corporate media is owned by the ruling class. They are directly threatened by communism. This is observable over the history of media that he's going to go through here. They are threatened by communism. This is very important, far more than fascism, which they're not actually threatened by at all. It actually benefit from. And this allows for a certain Manichaeism, painting like their enemies in a really reductive light in these stories they tell to try to convince you that they're your enemies too. And this also, kind of justifies like all of this third world intervention stuff where they fucking install right-wing puppet governments in other places that are arguably fucking capital F fascist. That's why there's apologia for all these like Latin American right-wing regimes that we're going to get into a little bit. Because who's telling the story? Someone whose interests are benefited by those and are threatened by communism. And so they sort of say in the book, this is the overall like religion of Western media. And I'm always talking about PR and Edward Bernays. The entire field of PR was birthed to use media as a tool for overthrowing democratically elected socialists in Latin American third world countries and stuff, and start installing these puppet regimes. So this is an outcome you see through it, and you see all these interesting double standards we're going to talk about a little bit, like just with like democracy. This comes up in one of the next chapters, but basically, like, if the country is a U.S. puppet, then all of their corruption and lack of democracy is apologized for, and it's framed as like they're on their way. El Salvador had their first election. It's not quite there yet, but it's the road to democracy. And then if it's Nicaragua, who is the dissenter, the Sandinistas, who have arguably more democratic elections, they are framed as non-democratic. And I don't know, I was just thinking about like Maduro a lot during this, because like there's like these arguments about whether he stole the last election, and like, I'll be honest with you, this is a hot take or whatever, and I don't even know that enough about it to really sign off on this, but I'm not sure. As a leftist, like, I want to defend him, but there's corruption in socialist countries too. The argument you should make, I think, is not that never happens. And no, it's a little naive. It's that it's fucking a double standard. Like, we do sham elections all the time in this fucking country. I have no business telling anyone that they're not democratic enough, Yeah. I don't know. Hopefully I didn't piss too many of our listeners off of that, because I'm on our side. I'm just trying to be nuanced here. So, anyways, before I get into the case studies, which is the rest of the book, which I'll just sort of like lightning round through, because there's it's a lot of stuff. But we don't need to go through all the details. Yeah, I just wanted to talk about the base superstructure thing a little bit. I think Chomsky understands communism. He's a libertarian socialist, which is an anarchist on some level. I don't know what he identifies as nowadays. I don't know. I haven't emailed him lately. But I think he understands communism and understands how it is like used and framed by the forces in this book. I think you should read this book as a Marxist. And I also wanted to talk about something that is a hot take, but I think I'm right about before I get into this. I also thought about this a lot with regard to Israel recently, because I think Marx and this book collectively really help to explain how all of this functions organically. And that's like a indispensable bit of wisdom, is to understand this as like a process. And it gets you out of conspiratorial thinking, which is trying to identify one party as the cause of a thing, right? You see this all the time, like right wing, they're like almost there. They're like, all of society is run by a small cabal of people. And you're like, right, capitalism. And they're like, the Jews, like they're just almost there, but they assign it to like a thing instead of a concept, right?
Mhm.
And there's a lot of conspiratorial thinking, even within like, this like weird, hazy, undefined left that just exists online now. And it does exist online. I'm not an online isn't real person. I don't believe people say that, but like, I'm literally like, we're talking about how like the internet created room for dissent in media and stuff like that. So it's in some ways more real than anything, because it's the only place people can really like spread these ideas. So I think it's important to be good at it. And I've noticed that there's kind of a left that I feel like doesn't understand the process stuff I'm talking about. They don't see it as a Marxist thing. That a lot of people get into like our circles, but they're really into just like being up, reading a lot about the CIA and the deep state and making these arguments that all of this wouldn't be happening if not for this one particularly insidious like factor. And it's like, well, why would there not be a deep state? It's a fucking facet of empire, right? Or there not be a CIA? And so I was thinking about this a lot recently, because I think, and it's gonna piss people off, but I think I'm right. I think it's kind of bad to make the argument that the United States is controlled by Israel, because you see this a lot where people are like, oh, they fucking just bought our government or whatever.
Yeah.
And I understand what you're saying. And before you fucking lose your mind on me, we all hate Israel. Like, it's a fucking ethno state. We're talking a lot about it for a reason here. We're against it. It fucking arguably shouldn't exist and all this stuff. I laughed really loud when we got bombed by Iran. Like, I'm on your side. I'm not arguing to defend Israel. When I say that, what I'm saying is when you reduce it to just Israel, you're actually letting the United States empire off the hook. And they want you to do that. And that's why via manufacturing consent and PR and stuff like that, you get these outcomes. Like, for example, when Israel would get super belligerent when Biden was in office, what did he do? He'd be like, oh, what the hell? Huh? I didn't know they were going to do that. And like, he's fucking lying. Like, he's the head of the United States,
Yeah.
That was PR. That was covering for their ass, because they knew it was unpopular for Israel to do this stuff, but they wanted to do it anyway. So the way to weasel out of that is to go, I didn't know, right? Oh, they're crazy. I can't control them, And Trump kind of did the same fucking thing recently when they did the preemptive attack. He did this weird, like, like they did what or whatever. And I was like, that's the same thing fucking Biden did. And if you believe that Israel controls Donald Trump or, Joe Biden when he was president, you're actually letting them off the hook for what they're doing, which is they tacitly endorsed all of this shit because they have the same fucking interests as Israel.
Yeah.
And there's a reason the United States sponsors Israel, and they're both doing it, and they're both bad. And that's why conspiratorial thinking is bad for this, of going like, oh, they've got blackmail on everyone, and they're doing compromat and whatever, and it's like a fun story, but no, it's a process. It's organic, right? It all comes back to Marx and capitalism and fucking the interests of The big multinational corporations. You are, what does he say? You are.
What does he say? I forget. I know he says, I'm mad as hell. I'm not going to take it anymore.
You will atone. No, that's
oh, right.
other
No,
guy.
this is the executive. That's right. Which is funny because this is another critique of Chomsky is he gets characterized as portraying the media essentially as that scene from Network. Like you say something out of line that bucks the sponsorship and you get dragged before the boss. He's always smoking a cigar for some reason. It's always a smoke-filled room is how Chomsky's argument is represented. Oh, you're saying this is a smoke-filled room, and you're told exactly what to say. Which number one, sometimes that does happen. Like there are plenty of examples in modern history of stories getting pulled because they offend sponsors. That's not a
Flack, but he describes that in the book.
right. Yeah,
Or, yeah.
exactly. And then number two, there's another Chomsky thing. He's very clear that he's not saying that there's this censorious media regime. He's saying that the people who are in elite media spheres don't have radical politics, so you don't really need to censor them because they go along with the common wisdom of the power elite.
Yeah. And if they dissent once or twice, it's like they're just veering a little bit or whatever. They don't even realize they're doing it. It's like in the circus, when they have a baby elephant, they tie its tail to a stake and it only can walk in a 3 feet radius. And then eventually they get rid of the stake because you don't actually need to control it anymore. It can leave, but it doesn't because it's confined in the mind ideologically, right?
Yeah.
This comic I know used to do a joke about that. That's why I remember that metaphor. He was like, isn't that an inspirational story? It's my friend John Morton. So each and every one of us should listen to this story and understand that if we work hard, we can grow up to trick and exploit a baby elephant. It's funny. It's not, you're not the elephant or the whatever. Anyways, so yeah, and honestly, so the flack part of the filter, that one filter, is actually kind of more similar to like the authoritarian Soviet Union thing. That is actual discipline, but it's coming from the corporate entity itself. Everything else he's saying, though, isn't like that. It's like these invisible things that just prevent outcomes from happening without having to like hit you with the stick. They're just like more psychological or not psychological, but like, yeah, I don't know. It's postmodernism. They're the boundaries of reality. So anyways, let's do a lightning round. Let's talk about these case studies that are the bulk of the book. Read the fucking book there if you are interested in these things at all. They are fascinating fucking stories and stuff that a lot of people probably don't know about. So first chapter is worthy and unworthy victims, and it focuses on like juxtaposing two stories and showing you how one is covered because it's a U.S. ally and one is covered because it's not. And it's so yeah, pretty easy concept there, right? I don't think it's that challenging. One of these things is about the assassination of Archbishop Romero in El Salvador, which is a crazy fucking story. And then the other one is the assassination of this guy Popouszko in Poland, who I cannot pronounce or spell his name, but it's something along the lines of Popouszko, and who was also like a religious figure, I think. And basically he talks about, how this Popouszko guy is in Poland, and Poland at the time is not something that the U.S. has an interest in politically. And so the fact that he's killed, they're able to narrate this as, oh, he was killed by the European leftist, whatever. So there's just nonstop coverage of the murder of this guy Popouszko in like the New York Times in this era, the 70s, 80s, whatever the fuck it is. And it's if media was objective, another really similar assassination would probably have an equal number of reportings on it in the New York Times, right? Well, this fucking Archbishop Romero in El Salvador was assassinated. And the thing that's interesting about this is that, there's like leftist guerrillas in El Salvador in this time, and then there's the fucking capitalist far right fascist regime that the United States installs to fight, Cold War proxy or whatever, to crush the threat of communism, which is a threat to the ruling class here. And it results in this thing where like a lot of the the guerrillas and stuff are killed and crushed pretty hard. And then there's this window for actually the Catholic Church in El Salvador to occupy the space of left dissent. This is a really hard concept, I think, for a lot of people like me who are like really against religion, but liberation theology is a thing. It's an outcome, especially in Latin America, where we do a lot of syncretism and like it's this could be a whole fucking episode on its own how this is possible. But there have been a lot of leftist movements that were religious. I mean, MLK, he was fucking Christian and stuff. It's not inherently a thing that's used to exploit and dominate. It happens a lot, but in this instance, it was the voice of leftist dissent. And the thing is, I think part of the reason for that is that like the communists here, they're pretty easy to like to shoo away and delegitimize, and that's part of what's going on with this media stuff here. People fucking respect the archbishop because you've installed Catholicism in this part of the world so hard, and people are really into Catholicism. So the fact that this archbishop started speaking out about the murders that the right-wing government in El Salvador was committing made it to where he's got a lot of legitimacy, and now he's a huge threat because he could actually rally people to become conscious about the fact that this military regime is fucking putting people down left and right. So they killed him, right?
Damn.
It's one of those things that's like, if you're not an idiot, if you got two eyes, they killed him, but it's like, it's kind of stitched up. It's kind of never really officially is how a lot of these things work. But I mean, it's like a crazy story. They fucking assassinated an archbishop who's like beloved because he was speaking out about these murders. And then at his funeral, a bunch of fucking people roll up with machine guns and they mow down everyone at the funeral. And that's clearly still the military regime of El Salvador, like putting down this thing. But that story gets reported on and told as that was the communists. Doesn't make any sense. Why would they shoot up their own guy's funeral, right? But like everything gets blamed on the left. So it's like another like really common thing that happens in these stories is that like violence by the right wing the media then uses it by just telling the story as if it was the left and then trying to convince people you shouldn't support them or whatever. It happens in Vietnam a lot too. Worthy and unworthy victims. So there were some women who were raped and murdered by the regime, and because they were American, so the story would have been swept away like nothing, like just like Gaza, a bazillion people dead, but it doesn't benefit the United States to talk about, right? But these were Americans, so somebody made a big stink, and they eventually had to kind of talk about it. And so like there's this concept of like worthy and unworthy victims. They're like an interesting blip in the kind of like and show. I guess the point of that story is to show how, if not for the fact that they were American, they would have been unworthy victims, and that is a massive graveyard of people that people just doesn't get reported on or whatever. And then so like another thing about this, the final thing about El Salvador, I'll say that's interesting is like centrism, right? So the media narrative about El Salvador during all this was that like they didn't report on this as if the government was right wing, which it was. The narrative was that the US backed government is like this sensible, middle of the road, fledgling democracy that's caught in a civil war between the far left and the far right.
Hate when that happens.
Right. Yeah.
So, call up Donovan. We gotta have you sing a big concert for the people of El Salvador for Stuck in the Middle with You.
Clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right. So this really had me thinking about centrism because of like Welcome Fest and all that shit or whatever, and like the really evil. I mean, it's people, people really believe in this like horseshoe theory shit and like stuff we've all been over a million times or whatever. But this is a really great example of how it is fucking evil because it reorients the entire story to claim that the far right is the center and then take the violence committed by the far right and tell you that was by the left, like with the funeral shooting I was just talking about.
Right.
And then marginalize the left out of the picture in all these ways. And it just like recasts everyone in the most fucked up way possible. And it should be a thing that you should look out for. You should have a little, alarm that goes off in your head when you see this stuff. Next chapter is legitimizing versus meaningless third world elections. So this chapter is just about Nicaragua, Guatemala, and El Salvador, and how I talked about this a little bit a minute ago, but like the Nicaraguan elections, are by this, they're run by the Sandinistas. The United States is backing the Contras. There's a great Clash album about this. It's nice. Like, this is where the Iran-Contra affair plays in all this stuff. The United States was backing the this right-wing death squad to try to overthrow the Sandinistas, or like a socialist government or whatever. And then in Guatemala and El Salvador, where we have puppet governments, they're also having elections. Let's look at all the differences in how the coverage or whatever, the disconsistencies or whatever. And like in Nicaragua, there were actually pretty free elections. They talk about a lot how there were like these delegations from places like Ireland that went to like monitor the elections just to report. And they reported on like the efficiency of like secret ballots and stuff like that. And then, you go to Guatemala and El Salvador and they don't have secret ballots. They don't do an election, efficiently and properly. But the Nicaraguan one in U.S. media is portrayed as like, really ominous, like undermining of democracy. And the ones that are conducted way worse in El Salvador and Guatemala are like, they're on the road to democracy. They're wow, exciting news and stuff. And like in Nicaragua, they had a spectrum of all political parties. They allowed their enemies to run, for office. And to some extent, I mean, there's, fucking no one's perfect and there's critiques to be made of this, but the shit that the fucking Sandinistas did, if they stifled anyone at all, you have to compare it to what happened in Guatemala and El Salvador before you make an argument that like, oh, they're so evil or whatever. Everyone is doing imperfect like elections to some degree.
Yeah.
The next chapter is really funny. This is some of the weirdest stories of all time. The KGB Bulgarian plot to kill the Pope. Free market propaganda as the news. So this chapter is about this thing that happened in 1981. There was a guy named Mehmet Ali Agca. He's a Turkish guy. He shot the Pope John Paul II, in Vatican City. He didn't kill him. He shot him and seriously injured him.
Damn.
And Agca was a Turkish fascist. He was associated with this neo-fascist faction in Turkey called the Grey Wolves, which is some cool CIA shit. Or some cool, weird, just fucking weird sounding 20th century espionage shit. And basically, somehow the United States media was able to craft a narrative that he was an op by the Soviet Union. Like a collaboration between the Soviet Union and Bulgaria, who's a Soviet Union ally. And that's an insane allegation to make, especially with like no evidence, which is how they made it. But all of this shit was laundered through a few writers with open ties to the CIA who wrote for like Reader's Digest, which is a really right-wing publication. I didn't realize it was like that important to the CIA. I always thought it was like old people like love their Reader's Digest, just like the joke when I was growing up. But well, I guess that makes sense. Fuck, because old people love conservative bullshit. But like, so it starts there, and then they go through this chapter how then through the Reader's Digest CIA thing, it gets into like all corporate media and TV and stuff, and this narrative just gets told as if it has any legitimacy. And if you pick through it at all, it's when you read stuff. Also, if you're like, the point here is to be media savvy. Look up the authors. You'll often see that they just work for the CIA. That should tell you stuff. Or they work for think tanks that are funded by deep state and stuff like that. Anyways, the narrative they pushed, it's called the SHK model because it was 3 writers they used to kind of formulate it. The narrative is what the USSR got a Turkish guy, hired him to shoot the Pope as a way to weaken NATO, because Turkey's a NATO country, and NATO's anti-communist, and so okay, sure, but like they kind of deconstruct this in this chapter, and they bring up a good point, which is that like it doesn't really make any sense that they would do this, because like why wouldn't they just send a Russian guy to do it? You know what I mean? Why does it have to be a Turkish person?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess to try to craft this Turkish NATO narrative, but the thing is, the plan only works if he is caught and identified as a Turk, which doesn't necessarily happen in an assassination. And also that he doesn't reveal that he had been hired by the Bulgarians and Soviets. So it's like they only torture him enough for him to be like, I'm a Turk, but not enough to tell him what's actually happening. Make any fucking sense. They also clearly tortured this guy into saying all of the shit that they made up, because he was in jail in Italy for like 17 months, and then with no evidence at all and nothing to back it up, just said, okay, I'm a Russian spy or whatever. Can I please get out of jail? But it's just like one of the most obvious, weird, made up things ever. Okay, almost done. Lightning round. Vietnam. So there's a really good chapter about the Vietnam War in this. It's one of the longest chapters. It, I don't know. I can't really run through the entire Vietnam War for you if in 5 minutes. But I mean, you kind of.
I was going to say check out Ken Burns, but there's probably some consent manufacturing going on with that documentary, from what I've heard.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, honestly, like the Vietnam War is one of those things that like I have read through a few times in my life, and each subsequent read through, like when I read through it here in this book, I understood that I had it kind of wrong before because of consent manufacturing and stuff. It's told fucking weird, and it's actually not as complicated of a story as it kind of seems when you hear it through like U.S. media. Israel Palestine is like that, it's got obscured with like these complex narratives or whatever. It's actually a pretty simple case of occupation. So I don't know, a few bullet notes about this though. The U.S. puppet regime in South Vietnam, the Diem regime, was not particularly politically popular, despite what they would tell us here. People in Vietnam liked the North Korean communist shit. They didn't like this regime of fucking outsiders that got installed to be like an arm of imperialism. And so the U.S. could not effectively do an op to make everyone like their thing and try to fucking liberalize like they did Korea and Japan and stuff like that. Just couldn't pull it off. So they said, okay, fuck it, we'll use military power instead. That's basically how the beginning of the U.S. intervention in Vietnam goes, because they came in basically to fill the vacuum of the and to reassert what was left behind from like French colonization.
Yeah.
And all this is justified with the fifth filter, right? Anti-communism. Like that's the point of the story is no. They're domino theory. They're going to do, communism and stuff. So we have to fucking be colonizers and all that shit. Anyway. So they hired Korean mercenaries and brought in all these outside people, and because Korea, we fucking dominated, right? And liberalized. Created a bunch of violence, used the media to attribute that violence to the Viet Cong. And then, fucking Tet Offensive, whatever all this shit. Go to high school, learn about it. But I'm going to talk a little about this concept of the Vietnam syndrome. So there's this idea that's fairly pervasive that the media lost the Vietnam War. And
Right.
the Vietnam War was like the first war that had like TV cameras kind of thing. It's kind of a similar thing going on with what I was talking about in Gaza and like the internet and stuff like that, and stuff recently like fucking Arab Spring and stuff like that. But yeah, so people make this argument that because there were so many cameras on it and they were wielded irresponsibly by media that has a quote unquote liberal bias, that actually cost the war because it lost support for the war.
Right.
And what's interesting about this one, I'll be honest with you, I used to kind of believe it, but not as a bad thing, as a good thing. Like
Right. Yeah.
I'm not for the Vietnam War. I was like, oh, no, like maybe like the hippies fucking won.
I mean, maybe from the other side, I'm before it, but
yeah, right. You know, but like I kind of was like, yeah, maybe the fucking people stopped the war. Like a lot of old boomer hippies are like, yeah, we fucking ended that war, man. You know, and I kind of don't think that's true anymore. Especially the way they laid it out in this book convinced me, because it doesn't really. I don't know. I mean, fuck. Does it matter if we protest? Right? Does that stop a fucking war? Like, does enough cheerleading stop them from doing these like evil military operations?
yeah. I mean, it doesn't, right. At least it, well, I don't know. I know Chomsky has compared the Iraq anti-war movement era, the second Bush era anti-war movement quite favorably to the 60s anti-war movement because, as he always points out, there were massive protests before the war even started. Whereas when Vietnam started, it was like basically he would talk to people in their living rooms about it, and you couldn't get a lot of people together. And then gradually consciousness rose. But I'm sure there's some extent to which both of them constrained the actions of the American state. Then again, that's kind of something you have to tell yourself because you have to do something. But I don't know if there's any way to ever say definitively like this was the thing that ended it. But I remember this a little bit, but I'm curious what his rationale is.
You know, actually, I think it's more complicated. I think you're right. Like, it actually would be dumb to be like, this didn't happen because it did, and it is important to protest and stuff like that because it does have an effect. But yeah, let's talk about what he says happened here because, I mean, what he kind of argues is that, so the conception of the Vietnam syndrome being a thing that like lost the war is a consent manufacturing propaganda tactic, and what it does is actually frame the media as left wing, even though they weren't, which is yet again, I've kind of been saying this every time we do this or whatever. But, he says that like actually the media were loyal lapdogs for the establishment by and large throughout the Vietnam War. Most of the coverage of it was exactly what the United States wanted you to see, and they obeyed their orders from the State Department and stuff like that. And where there was dissent, it was really heavily contained. So there was a lot of like dissent in the country. There was a lot of anti-Vietnam War shit happening, but only so much of it made it to like the media. And they allowed one Janine Garofalo on and then whatever. But by coming back around and saying that the media is super liberal and we lost the war from them, it does like a couple things at the same time. It's a real mind fuck. It simultaneously disciplines the media for dissenting even the tiniest bit, like at all.
Mm-hmm.
And also takes what was a right-wing coverage of the media and casts that as the left, which then allows you to shift even further right, which is this, like I was saying earlier, with like this weird, like, well, we got to balance everything out thing. Like, it's all predicated on this false premise that the media has a left bias, which it doesn't, or whatever. So he talks about how the legacy of this is then after that, there's an even further right-wing sort of media based on the idea that like, every U.S. international intervention after the Vietnam War, they get to say, well, we can't do Vietnam syndrome again, right? We can't, like, don't even talk about this as if it's bad, because that's what happened in Vietnam, which it isn't what happened. It's not the reason the United States lost the war. I mean, there's like myriad reasons that the U.S. lost. One of them is the Viet Cong. I mean, give them their fucking their credit here or whatever. But it's it's just an interesting reframing of the thing, and I think important to keep in mind that it's a good point. The official media was actually very, very like supportive of the war still, and in the ways that it wasn't supportive, it's what the cynicism thing I was talking about earlier at the top of this. The post-war narrative of the Vietnam War isn't like, there's no way to deny that the United States fucked up. It's like such a bad botch that like no one would buy it if you said like, whoops, like that was wrong and the fucking Viet Cong were right and we lost, right? So since you can't say that, the narrative is that the war wasn't morally wrong, it was just really badly executed. And this is like that cynical liberal David Simon wisdom that you hear over and over and over again. Is America's not wrong, but like, oh man, we just really, it's a tragedy that like we fumbled this or that. This is also like liberal historical view, Dan Carlin type shit. I just hear like those types of people kind of apologize for the US in this very subtle way. And it's just like this all the time. And I think that's how they stitched up Vietnam in a really, really insidious way. And the final chapter is Laos and Cambodia. I'm going to skip over Laos because I don't know. I missed it a little bit. It's subtle, and Cambodia is more interesting. And I don't know. I didn't have enough notes for it. But Cambodia, right? So the story of the Cambodian genocide is fascinating. I think everyone should read about it if you have a chance. It's fucking insane. Pol Pot is a bad person, nominally a Marxist. Sometimes I wonder, there's like 14-year-old like communists on Twitter who like defend anything. Like they just watch anime and they love North Korea or whatever. And I'm not even saying North Korea is bad. I'm just saying, like, people get out of their depth a little bit. I've always wondered if there's a Pol Pot tanky out there who's like, I think like we all kind of agree the Khmer Rouge was bad, right? No one's like defending it as communism, right?
No, I mean, no. Chomsky did. He gets this often, and I do not know the specifics, but this is something that always people bring up as there's claimed to be some inaccuracies here that make Khmer Rouge seem a little more a little less bad than reality, but I can't speak on that. I know this is a point of contention.
Honestly, I got a whiff of that when I was reading this.
Okay.
And I think it's a valid critique because he maybe is overcorrecting because he hates the media coverage of the Khmer Rouge so much. But I don't think it goes to the extent that it should delegitimize kind of what they're saying here, because that the point he's making is just unfair treatment, and it is treated unfair because it's treated inconsistently, even though it's fucking wrong. Like the story here is they map out the genocide in Cambodia into 3 phases, and then they talk about the inconsistencies between the 3 phases, because the first phase is the U.S. bombing that like Kissinger and Nixon did secretly, where they bombed the shit out of Laos and Cambodia. And I mean, this is all happening in the wake of like colonization and stuff like that. And like, okay, so there's an interesting thing about this. There's a lot of journalism that they talk about Cambodia and Laos, where they say like, they try to pin everything on Vietnam and on the North Korean, or on the VC, and they say stuff like, in Laos and Cambodia, peaceful farmers loved nothing more than to just farm before the Viet Cong came upon and like upended their way of life or whatever. And this is a framing device. It starts history conveniently at a certain point. You always have to ask, what happened before that, dude? Yeah. Fucking French colonization and shit, like intervention and stuff. History didn't start on October 7th. That's why when they tell the story of Gaza, they always fucking started October 7th. Like, you gotta go, what the fuck happened before that? Why would that happen to begin with? Why were the Viet Cong in Cambodia or Laos or whatever to begin with? So, the U.S. is bombing like really heavily in secret, Operation Menu, all that shit. And they kill a fucking ton of people, and they're trying to do a lot of damage and then blame it on the communists to get to manufacture the consent for, imposing capitalism and all this stuff. And there's just a massive amount of death and destruction. The land is just leveled to a wasteland. And then, this is a complicated story. There's long fucking things you can read about it, podcasts about it and stuff. If you want to get the like real play-by-play here, but in broad strokes, this kind of created a vacuum for what was an insignificant, weird fringe faction, the Khmer Rouge, to take power and fill it. Pol Pot is like this weird Cambodian guy, like studied in France, learned Marxism, sort of, arguably came back to Cambodia. He's got like 4 or 5 different names. Pol Pot means like some guy, like a vague, like John Doe or whatever in Cambodia, and he named himself that as like this weird populist, I am everyone thing or whatever. Fucking insane person. Isn't doing Marxism, I think, is the critique here. It's not that Marxism is bad, it's that he's doing it right. Creates this insane fucking Holocaust, basically. Everyone's just devastated. No, you only have a fucking cup of rice to eat every day. Everyone has to wear black pajamas. Empties out the cities. That's like a really weird thing he did. Is he fucking purged everyone out of the cities to like reform everything. This all happened around like the new year, so it's known as Year Zero because like it just coincided with like new, fucking the new history starts now or whatever. Really eerie shit. Later on in his life, he's known as like Grandpa 37 or something. Was the name he gave himself. Complete fucking insane person. Anyways, it's pretty understood at this point that it's like some pretty horrible shit that happened in history, right? But what they the reason they bring it up in this book is to compare media coverage of Phase 1, the U.S. bombing, to the Khmer Rouge, the Pol Pot era, Phase 2, because this is a process of him killing a lot of people. For a while in the beginning, the United States had more bodies on the death toll than Pol Pot, but like the coverage of Pol Pot was much more. So he's pointing out the inconsistency with like, well, when we bomb a bazillion people, it's apologized for, and then when Pol Pot does it, that like, and at this point, Pol Pot is nominally a communist, so they're like, they're really against him, so they start reporting on how fucking horrible everything is. This is really complex the way this plays out because there's all these different shifting sides. So the important part of the story, anyway, is that after this, Phase 3 is that I think the Viet Cong push Pol Pot out into Thailand. Like he loses power and he ends up reforming the Khmer Rouge while living in exile in Thailand. And now he is in Thailand and he's an ally of China, which the U.S. is an ally of. And so now the U.S. supports Pol Pot, this person we've just been reporting on as like the next Hitler. Mm-hmm. But because we're now on the same side of a thing and our main motivation is that we hate Vietnam, we're even siding with China, which is like also, communist and, whatever. Literally there's all these splits in between communist factions about whether who's real communist or whatever. There's also all this Dengue shit happening or whatever. But like, that Phase 3 is this, it's called Bleeding Vietnam. And basically Deng Xiaoping's argument was to just like keep Vietnam because fighting in Cambodia and Thailand and all this stuff against their little pawn, this Pol Pot psycho, because it'll just bleed them out or whatever. And so it's this really complicated fucking factionalized thing at the end of all this, where now he's, they point out like, what the fuck? Now you like Pol Pot, and now it's like this weird indefensible thing because you just called him Hitler. So how do they solve this in the media? How does the propaganda model apply here? Omission. They just stopped really covering Cambodia. And when it was covered, there's a guy named William Shawcross who was like prominent journalist in this era of coverage of like Cambodia and Indochina and stuff like that. And like the way he twisted it up was the only way to do this, the only way to like bullshit artist this, is he said, like, he basically argued that it's actually North Vietnam's fault. It's the VC's fault that United States had to ally with Pol Pot because they are so evil or whatever. So that makes them even more evil, right? Which is just like insane twisting mental gymnastics, right? Anyways, that's a crazy fucking story. And yeah, there's a lot going on there, but I thought, the broad strokes of that are the 3-phase thing and just looking at all the different media. And yeah, and after that the book ends. It's fucking long. This has been a long podcast. I'm sorry. But yeah, that's basically, that's a bunch of case studies that flesh out this propaganda model. And I think it's worth beating yourself over the head with, because if you've ever been indoctrinated to believe this or that about any of these wars, this is a good eye opener, and it's a good commentary on, how all this stuff, how capitalism and empire reproduces itself via this stuff. And it's relevant today. I think it's relevant today, both for the reasons I was describing earlier, with like there's a new manifestation of this, but also get the fuck off the internet. If you think every single person is against like what Trump did or what Israel did or any of this foreign policy stuff, you might be in a bubble. Like I go out and I talk to people a lot. They suck. People believe insane things, and there's a reason there's fucking media right now is just blasting nonstop twisted fucking lies about Iran. They are trying to indoctrinate your fucking parents with this shit, and it's going to work. They wouldn't do this shit if it didn't do something, right? I don't know. I think so. Maybe you'd argue that they would, but I kind of think, why would they dump so much effort into this if it stopped working 10 years ago? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. Anyways, thank you for letting me yell manufacturing consent at you, audience, and also Anders. I know he talked like a crazy person this entire episode.
No, it's a classic. Everyone should check it out. I have a copy that I have skimmed. Maybe I've read the thing to completion because I pick it up and look up random stuff in it sometimes. So that adds up.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's one of those ones you could just pick up and go, I want to learn about this fucking Grey Wolf thing. I'll read about that for a minute.
Yeah.
Anyways, thank you for listening to the show. It's Pod Damn America. We have a Patreon if you enjoy the show. We are listener funded and don't do ads because I'm like this. And I believe that that's a good way to do these things. So, and also our, I guess another thing to add to that is via what we learned from the book here, our audience is not rich people, I guess. So they can't advertise to you anyway. So if you enjoy the show, patreon.com/poddamnamerica. We do a bonus episode every week. We have Discord and stuff. I don't know, sometimes we watch movies and shit in there. And also it just helps. So if you want help, we're just doing this to maintain our careers as whatever the fuck we're doing here, comics, podcasters. So please consider joining our Patreon. I would really appreciate it. I am a comedian. If you're listening for the first time, I live in Los Angeles, and hey, I've just booked a show at probably the best alt comedy venue in LA, maybe the country. Because LA is LA. I don't know what I'm gonna do yet. They literally just threw me a spot because they like me and said, "Fucking do something here." So I'm doing a show at the Lyric Hyperion on July 25th. I probably just book a bunch of funny comics and do stand up and stuff, maybe a couple other weird things. But if you're in LA, keep an ear out. July 25th. That's a Saturday night at 9:30. Come see me at the Lyric Hyperion.
And I am Matt Andersley here on social media. Vanquished is my other podcast about failed presidential candidates. And Paid Protest. There's going to be, thanks to anybody who came out to the Queen's show last week. It was a lot of fun. We got another one coming up at Silo in Bushwick on July 11th. We'll put the link in the description. It's going to be a great show. Nato Green is going to be in town from San Francisco. We also got Gracie Kanan, John F. O'Donnell, and a couple other people who I forgot to look up the image before I sent it. Actually, no, I have it right here. We also have Calvin Cato, Sidney Duncan, and hosted by myself, Freddie G, and Sharif Hassan. 7:30 on July 11th.
Cool. All right. Well, you have no excuse not to see one of our shows. You live either on the left or the right half of this country. You have to drive and come see it. All right. It's manufactured.